Hey folks, and welcome to another episode of Crit Hit Reviews with your host, Arlyeon. On today's episode, I'll be talking about the review copy I received of Creact Games' roguelite action RPG, Neverinth. Find out if this dive into dungeon crawling was a drag, or if this voyage to Valhalla really was heavenly. The gods were right to fear Ragnarok. For when that dreadful destiny came to pass, they found themselves annihilated. Even the world tree, Yggdrasil, found itself sundered. And yet there is still a small sliver of hope. A seed of that mythic train remains, nestled away within the twisting spaces of the Neverinth. This otherworldly maze serves as a trial ground to the Valkyrie, and also the final resting place of a dying world's hopes. Or something to that effect, really. The crux of the story is dramatically presented to you in an opening movie, but beyond that bit of bombastic theatrics, you'd be hard-pressed to find any narrative developments as you proceed to the game. To the extent that there's not even any sort of epilogue to be found, or small bits of flavor to immerse oneself in. Then again, it's perhaps not quite surprising, given there's certain elements that make this a bit of an anomaly as far as my traditional review titles go. And that's because while it has recently gone from early access to full release on Steam, and therefore become eligible for review, that does not mean it's actually a finished title. In fact, from the word go, you'll be introduced to a slightly disconcerting screen that introduces the game as still in early access, as well as the game being version 0.4. And that's not inaccurate, considering the game was forced to release due to the development team for Neverinth hitting a few obstacles, ranging from budget elements to more personal issues that you can glean from their postings tied to the health of family members, and their overall availability. Which is to say, there's a decent likelihood that COVID-19 may have compounded things. That said, while I certainly can't speak much about the game's story in its current state, I can at least give you folks the skinny on how it plays. And honestly, Neverinth does have some elements that make it both challenging and interesting. The basic premise sees you roaming through a randomly generated dungeon, navigating through enemies, and some altogether challenging bosses in stamina-based hack-and-slash combat. That said, there's some interesting nuances to the combat as well, such as Neverinth's life debt system, which allows players to grey out portions of their health in order to either speed up their actions or use a weapon's ultimate attack. What makes this a tense decision is the fact that getting hit causes the entirety of the grayed out section to be lost, and it can also be tremendously rewarding, as not only does this give players access to more powerful abilities, playing well and landing hits also removes that debt, allowing a sort of ebb and flow for players who are adept enough to wield those abilities and not get hit. I was also rather fond of the variety the game provided with its characters. Like, sure, there wasn't much to be had from them in regards to any deep lore, but the differences between them aren't strictly cosmetic or as boring as just some different stat growth. Rather, each of the different Valkyries has their own unique evasion option, which helps to give them a distinct feeling from each of their peers. What's more, with each one you acquire a new style of weapon can be found in the dungeon, ultimately lending itself to a neat little armory that you can mix and match with your Valkyries. And unlike the more subtle differences between your protagonists, the differences in the weapon styles is a lot more drastic, as they all have their own unique movesets to master, which helps provide some rather distinct ways in which to progress through the game. It also made me a little bit miffed that the game's current release date means we'll ultimately only be seeing 3 characters as opposed to the 5 which the Steam page promised, and still promises since last I checked. Still, even without those characters or weapon styles, there's quite an array of ornaments to choose from, and that's because the game has a decent amount of variant weapons to unlock. And I do mean unlock, as whilst you're granted the basic versions of the weapon and a few alternatives when you're first introduced to them, you'll need to dive into the game's achievement system in order to unlock the strongest variants. Honestly, a fair bit of Neverinth's gameplay loop is tied to clearing the objectives on these lists, given that's how you unlock the other characters, their weapon styles, and even how you unearth a rather challenging bonus stage to dive into. Also fashion. There's a ton of fashion for the characters to be unlocked, which is purely aesthetic, but neat to acquire, especially given that they differ between the Valkyries even when wearing the same outfit. I mean, there's also the totem system to unlock too, though this starts to venture into things which I both loved and hated. On one hand, these items were neat, since they provided players with the ability to choose between carrying around one of several different styles of equipable item, which provided permanent stat bonuses so long as they were equipped, as well as some interesting passive enhancements if you managed to completely fill up the totems. On the other hand, it is very luck-oriented and grindy process that makes me want to suplex RNGesus into submission, if only because getting optimal stats on anything becomes a nightmarish process. Needing to farm random drops and then hoping they're the right size and type is a doozy of an endeavor, and more often than not, I simply settled with what I could to activate a tome's passive ability, rather than taking the deep dive into fine-tuning them. And unfortunately, that's not actually a choice I can go back on anymore either, because I managed to glitch out the totem system entirely and lost the ability to change which totems I had equipped or even to modify the gems within them. And this hurts a lot, given just how heavily it plays in your character's progression. Like, yes, you get solid stats from your totems and the permanent boosts from leveling your characters, but there's a third avenue of progression which also contributes heavily to the growth of your character's strength, namely the goddess statues, and what those boil down to is a means of spending currency you'll be earning in the dungeon in order to just purchase stat boosters / passive abilities for that specific run. And what makes this frustrating is that the gems serve as a means of, somewhat ironically, counteracting the RNG heavy element of this system. Somewhat. The abilities that are available for purchase will always be up to RNGesus, which is then further compounded by the fact that you have a naturally low % chance of actually acquiring those passive abilities. We're talking like 20% here, and given that these scale up in currency costs with each time you purchase them, whether or not you get the passives, makes the totems almost pivotal for success, and that's because the gems in them not only carry stat boosts, but also serve to modify your chance of acquiring those passive skills, and by a significant margin if you stack them. So loss of that system is a big oof. Like, yeah, you do gain a gradually stacking buff even without them, but that frequently boils down to a lot of wasted effort, and it resets whenever you do finally get the passive ability anyways, so you can expect a whole lot of spending experience and getting bupkis for it for the most part. Still, whilst the game does scale in a not-so-gradual, read painful, manner, I found myself able to navigate the normal enemies well enough. It was the bosses where I most often found myself struggling, and that's because they represent a vast difference from their lackeys running around the stages. Like, they've actually got some decent moves at their disposal to gank you with, and a generally daunting amount of attack and defense. Enough so that I was actually super excited when I saw an announcement for a new boss to come with the full release. And to be fair, there certainly is an altogether giant and rather cute salamander in the boss arena for the otherwise empty-looking penultimate stage. That said, it's a permanently napping and wants nothing to do with me style of giant lizard, which, honestly, left me pretty annoyed since both that stage and the ensuing one felt needlessly large. Honestly, the final two stages are just a little time-wasty feeling is probably the best way I can describe it, since you're just sort of jogging through these relatively lengthy empty hubs and adjoining loading screens to fight a singular boss, and it's just such an annoying experience. And perhaps the game's boss rush mode would help to deal with that, but given that it would require me to beat the final boss 3 times, and I've only successfully dunked on her once, and I no longer have the ability to fine-tune my totems or anything, I'm not really going to be weighing in on that boss rush mode. So let's move on. I will have to say, I am pretty fond of the game's visuals. Like, it very much does have some pretty character designs, both for protagonists as well as the enemies. Enough so that I really wish I'd gotten the chance to see what the other two intended characters would have looked like in action, or that cute-looking giant salamander who's just being a good boy and snoozing. Despite that, I won't knock the overall vibe to the combat, as it managed to look quite satisfying, and the area designs are fairly nice. And also I have to say that on a sound design level, I was generally fond of the game, as it has some great level themes and boss music. That said, there were times where I found my patience wearing thin, if only because certain attacks generate some really irritating noises, and anything that causes you to attack more quickly, either because you have a little phantasm that mirrors all your moves, or something that adds an attack at the end of all of your hits, it starts to become like a horrible cacophony with every swing of your weapon. But yeah, you know what? We've done it. Having said all of this, there is little more to do than sum things up for the conclusion. And the simple fact of the matter is, I have on and off poked into this game since it was in early access. It's a genuinely charming title that I had a lot of fun diving into and navigating. The combat is a blast, and I used to go back to it with each new update to try more and more of what it had to offer, and it was a lot of fun to unlock things and try out the various weapons. That said, it's easy to see that this was released into an unfinished state, not only because of the elements in the game itself which tell this to the player, but also the bugs which persist within it, elements like its empty 2 final stages. Hell, even the UI does a decent job of tattling, given that it hints at things that can't be acquired, like the 3rd totem slot. Ultimately, there's enough there to serve as a decent foray into its world, but the seams where it's sewn together are certainly visible, which makes it hard to recommend this to folks who aren't fans of this sort of game. Ultimately, this is why I rate it as a fumble at best, which is a shame, really, since there had been so much I'd been looking forward to this game that will simply never materialize. Anywho, thanks for tuning in, folks. If you happen to agree with what I say, disagree, or just have something to say to me, feel free to comment. And for those interested in more indie reviews, developer interviews, or one day those Monday TTRPG podcasts again, you can hit the subscribe button and the bell so you know when there's a new release. There's also the Discord. You can click the link in the banner or description so you can be part of our community, the Crit Hit Cauldron. And lastly, if you'd like to help support the channel, we do have a coffee running now to help supplement funds for a lovely editor Rand, and make sure we can continue to provide quality content. Again, check the description of the banner for demo links. That said, I will catch you on the next episode of Crit Hit. Take care till then, folks.